Thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to be with all of you today and share some of what I may describe as the new kinds of thinking that is happening within the government of India on major sectors such as the water sector, but not only the water sector. It's a broader concern with the institutional challenges that are faced by the entire development effort. I'd like to just begin by going over what I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but it's important to sort of set the context for why and how this newness that I speak of in development thinking is emerging within the government. As you all know, that India embarked upon a process of what are now called economic reforms from around the 1990s. And in a sense, the entire Indian growth story seems to date from that time when India emerged, as it has today, as one of the fastest growing economies across the world. And there was a great excitement about what this improved rate of growth would be able to do for the Indian people. But as it has been recorded now, because we've had 20 years of this experience, and you used a very important word, which is now what the government of India speaks of, that is inclusiveness in this growth process. The feeling after 20 years is that though there was rapid economic growth, it has not been terribly inclusive. And on the other hand, there has been the emergence of unprecedented crises across especially certain pockets of the country, where it is now recorded that more than 200,000 farmers have committed suicide in this period. And we know this because, it's not data from civil society or some activist organizations. It is the data that is available with the National Crime Records Bureau. Because as you know, to commit suicide is a crime. And one of our chief ministers of one of the suicide-infested states is on record as saying that I'm going to put these guys who have broken the law. And an insensitivity that has also come to light in these last 20 years. And it was most dramatically, I think, expressed by the Indian people themselves. At least that is the interpretation that is given to what happened in 2004, which was a kind of watershed election where a party which was claiming that India is shining was voted out of power, and democratically people opted for a different government. The analysis of electoral verdicts can be, of course, very complex, but certainly it appears that the government which came to power interpreted this verdict to mean that we need to do something about inclusive growth. We need to work in a way which actually makes sure that the large mass of Indian people get included in this growth story. And in a sense, the 2009 verdict has reinforced this message. And there seems to be a renewed commitment towards moving in the direction of inclusion. The most objective, palpable indication of this is in the enormous increase in the financial resources that are being devolved to programs meant for inclusion, such as programs of rural development, such as programs for the development of infrastructure, whether it's water, sanitation, health, education. All of these have received enormous increases in year after year that we have seen since 2004. However, what I'm actually trying to highlight today is the fact that with all these increases, and with all the increases in outlays for all these programs, the fact is that we have not seen a situation where these outlays have got transformed into enduring outcomes on the ground. And the Prime Minister of India is on record is consistently expressing this concern that somehow we seem to have taken, in a sense, the easy way out. With these increased rates of growth, with buoyant revenues, we seem to have improved allocations. But the allocations are not translating into real change on the ground. And that is really what I want to talk about today with all of you, and try to share what the new government is thinking, and the new planning commission, which is taken over last year, is trying to do or initiate in terms of changes in the design, the institutional design of these programs, so that they are implemented in a way that actually translates these outlays into enduring outcomes on the ground. And as you said, this applies across sectors, but I'll begin with a brief overview of the water sector, because in a sense that's what we have chosen for today's discussion as a focal point, because it illustrates many of the issues that characterize problems, in fact, across sectors. And I'll sort of just take you over a very brief synoptic view of India's water sector and the challenges that we face there. And in a sense, it cuts across urban-rural boundaries. So, in fact, that is one of my major points, that we should not be looking at resources within these silos, whether these are departmental silos or regional silos. It's very important to take a unitary view of a resource like water. So to begin with, let's just understand where our water resources are going. Unlike England, for example, where you allot 1 to 2% of your water resources to irrigation, India is allotting as much as 80% to irrigation. And irrigation is a major consumer of water in India. And even for an urban planner, it's very important to recognize this fact, because I'll come back to that later. Urban-rural conflicts on water are the increasingly characteristic feature of India's development. So if 80% is going to irrigation, where is this water coming from? And when we look at that, again we see in the last 30 years a very dramatic change in the profile of India's water resources. And that is characterized by an overwhelmingly increasing dependence on groundwater. Today, 80% of our drinking water is coming from groundwater. But at the same time, more than 60% of irrigation is also coming from groundwater. So in a sense, the same aquifer, the underground stores of water, are being tapped for both drinking water needs and irrigation requirements. And I've just written in the midterm appraisal of the 11th five-year plan in the chapter on water resources that in a sense the left hand of drinking water does not know what the right hand of irrigation is doing. The drinking water department is located within the Ministry of Rural Development for rural areas and the Ministry of Urban Development for urban areas, while irrigation is handled by the Ministry of Water Resources. And there is absolutely no mechanism of coordination across these departmental silos. So there is no surprise then, although it is a very remarkable fact of this period, that a water crisis has been engendered by, in a sense, government policy. That areas which were abundant in water today are facing major crises of groundwater because a very simple elementary fact of the science of hydrogeology has not been borne in mind. This is not a point I'm making from the standpoint of, often made by civil society or by ecologists, people who are very concerned about nature. I'm talking about a basic principle of hydrogeology, that there has to be a balance between the rate of extraction and the rate of recharge when we are talking of groundwater. And that there are immense variations in the rates of natural recharge across aquifer types. And this is something, this is a fact the midterm appraisal of the 11th plan is hammering hard, because it's such an important fact for a country so overwhelmingly dependent on groundwater, but there is no cognizance of it in any development program or plan policy document which has been enunciated in India. And that is that only 30% of India's land mass is underlain by the kinds of aquifers which are suitable to deep borewell technology, which are the alluvial aquifers, which are found in the Indo-Gangetic plain in the north or the Krishna-Godavari basins in the south. These are the areas where that technology makes sense, because these are the areas where if you drill deep for groundwater, the rates of natural recharge, that when it rains, the aquifer will be replenished. And so it makes sense to use a technology like that, although, immediately one should add the caveat that even in these areas now, as has been recently revealed even by NASA satellite pictures, that there is an overwhelming over-extraction of groundwater, more than 130%. The mind boggles to say that the level of groundwater development is 130%. I mean, a resource one would think would be fully utilized, which is 100%. But it's 130% because in a sense, you're drawing water from adjoining areas. Perhaps Punjab and Haryana are drawing from Rajasthan, and Rajasthan is drawing from Uttar Pradesh. It's a mind-boggling situation in the alluvial heartland, which is just 30%. What is the rest of India? 54% are hard rock formations, where the rates of recharge of groundwater are extremely low. Water has taken thousands of years to accumulate below the ground. Many of these rocks were formed through volcanic eruptions when the African continent and the Indian subcontinent separated millions of years ago, and that is when volcanic eruptions occurred, and the cooling of that molten lava formed these basaltic Deccan traps, as they are called. And you can imagine that, at that time, the water that is slowly percolated below this ground is due to the kind of vesicles that are formed by the trapping of the gaseous, outflows during those volcanic eruptions. And those are the kinds of pores that these rocks show, apart from the kind of compression of the earth and the faults and folds that have occurred over time. So there's a very, small, avenue for water to go below the ground in these rock formations. And so water has taken thousands of years to accumulate in these reservoirs. They're actually fairly plentiful. But what we've done in the last 30 years is that we've literally mined this groundwater, which took these thousands of years to accumulate below the ground. And that's 54% of India's land mass. The remaining 16% is the mountainous regions, where again we have the same problem of very low rates of groundwater recharge, and you have to exercise great caution while tapping these reservoirs of water. But what we have done is, we have adopted the one-size-fits-all unscientific approach. I'm not talking now, somebody who's bothered about nature, etc. I'm talking about basic principles of hydrogeology, as I said, that you are using the same technology which could have been appropriately used, let's say, in areas which are alluvial soil, where the rates of natural recharge are high. You've used that same deep borewell drilling technology in areas where the water took so long to go below the ground that today you've led to what we can call a human-engendered water crisis in large parts of India. And so we need to really have a look at how we are managing our groundwater. So that's, in a sense, point number one about the major fact of water resources in India and how they are being mismanaged, and how, therefore, we need to think about the change that needs to be brought about in our water policies. The second major element of water policy in India has been, as you know, the construction of these large storage structures, the large dams, around which various movements, popular movements have emerged over the years, which have displaced millions of people and have displaced the most marginalized, largely the tribal people, who have been rendered homeless and have crowded the urban metros as a result of this displacement. And there has been ecological devastation in our forest areas, etc. But what I am focusing is not on all these enormous tragedies. I am actually, even if you look at it narrowly from the point of view of water resource management, let's see what our record has been. We've spent millions of dollars over the years on building these structures, but very little has been done to develop the commands where this water is meant to go. The farmers in whose name these structures were built have not benefited in the manner that they were supposed to. When such a structure is planned, as you know, there is a cost-benefit appraisal that is undertaken. And when that is undertaken, there are assumptions made about the cropping pattern that will be followed when so much water becomes available. And at times, in order to justify the cost-benefit ratio, what is done is to understate the depth of irrigation so that you can overstate the area that you can irrigate. It's very simple. There's a volume of water that every reservoir stores. What is volume? Is area into height or depth. So if the depth of irrigation, that is, if the crop is grown which doesn't use too much water, you can naturally be stating that you will be irrigating a large area. The command area can be stated as being very high. But what has typically happened in Indian dams is that very little attention has been paid to these initial assumptions. And for example, if you take the most controversial of them all, the Sardar Sarovar project on the Narmada, which has just received investment clearance to the extent of 39,000 crores from the government. If you study the irrigation command of Sardar Sarovar, it's been highly studied because it's been controversial, it's also been many years in the making. You find sugarcane and banana being grown in the head reaches of the command area, and the arid regions of Kutch and Saurashtra, for whom this dam was politically conceived or popularly supported in Gujarat, may not be elsewhere, but in Gujarat there was huge popular support, we must never forget, for the Sardar Sarovar project. because it was meant to be the solution to the droughts of Saurashtra and Kutch. Those regions are thirsting for water. And it's precisely because we have not paid attention to what I call the soft aspects of development. We typically, this is the engineer-economist, if I may say so, nexus. I'm an economist, so no offense meant to anyone, but I think the offense is meant as well. That,
Nicely.
yeah, I mean, I think offense better be meant now, otherwise we continue to tread along the same path, that this engineering mindset, which is concerned only about construction, about creation of hardware, and forgets everything else after that, forgets the fact that tribals get displaced and we need to do something about their rehabilitation, forgets about the fact that farmers need to get water in the command, and something has to be done, therefore, to develop the command areas, which requires other skills, maybe skills of social mobilization, skills of cultural anthropology. I mean, you have to understand who you are dealing with. Who are these people? They are not just figures in your cost-benefit analysis. They are people who need to develop systems of sharing a resource, which is a common pool resource. I mean, after all, it's available in the command, and unless you develop these systems carefully, unless you address the management challenge, you cannot solve the problem of the needs of our farmers for water, or the drinking water requirements of our urban settlements or our villages. It just cannot be done if you are only satisfied, or satisfied only by just building your dam and forgetting about it. And of course, the great motivations there are not just of a certain kind of intellectual mindset, it's also to do with the kind of, I've been traveling around, trying to understand the problem of leakage of water. But it's not only leakage of water, it's also leakage of financial resources that motivates a lot of this construction, because there's a lot of money to be made on the side in these large contracts. And I think there is this entire lobby which has dominated decisions and has promoted construction after construction without paying attention to the way we are utilizing the resource. So there is this huge, therefore, question of what we are doing about managing the water resources that we've already created. The ultimate irony which I brought out in the midterm appraisal of the 11th plan is that since we formulated the Accelerated Irrigation Benefit Program, a program of the Government of India which subsidizes creation of irrigation infrastructure in the states, there has been no increase in net irrigated area in India. For the last 15 years, it's completely stagnated. And it is precisely this period when there's been huge increase in these investments that I'm talking about. So, there will be no, sort of mystery or doubt or confusion about the fact that we have deeply mismanaged our water resources. The third major element which I'd like to place before you of the kind of worrisome situation that we are faced with in India has to do with the way we have handled the whole urban issue of, or the industrial use of water. Let's look at statistics which have not even been presented in government documents, but which are very important to emphasize. But what is the proportion of recycled water used by Indian industry or used by urban settlements in India? And I mean, you'll be shocked. I mean, there's hardly any use of, there's such an overwhelming reliance on fresh water resources for industrial use, for uses which can easily be managed through recycling. A country like Singapore uses recycled water even for the semiconductor industry, which has very high quality demands of water. But in India, I mean, we don't even manage to recycle water for ordinary industrial use. And the further consequence of that is that the state of our rivers, the state of water quality in our rivers. We have had a Ganga Action Plan, a river sacred to millions of Indians, and there's a great brouhaha about all this in our country. But actually, when you examine the Ganga Action Plan, you're not starting at all at the point where you should start, which is treating the effluent which is being indiscriminately dumped into the river. We don't have enough sewage treatment plant capacity in the country to be able to ensure that the water that reaches the river is of a certain quality. And we're spending, again, thousands of crores of rupees on cleaning the river. But how can you clean the river if you don't stop dirtying it? So, it's these kinds of elementary mistakes So on one hand, there is a shortage of, you're becoming dependent on groundwater to such an extent that there is a groundwater crisis. On the other hand, you're polluting your water sources because you're not treating the effluents at source, and therefore you're compounding the problem, which in both ways, both in terms of the supplies available and the quality of the water that is at our command. So having sort of highlighted these features of the water sector, what the government is now thinking, and that's why I was saying that this chapter I've written on water resources, in a sense, it's a tribute to the Planning Commission, because the Deputy Chairman continues to be the Deputy Chairman who was there in the 11th plan, and the midterm appraisal is a critique of the plan that he made. And I'm glad to say that we've been given complete sanction to go ahead. The Prime Minister, as the Chairman of the Planning Commission, has actually asked me now to prepare a paper which would give direction to policy in the water sector, which would mark a decisive break from these mistakes of the past. This chapter has been written, the midterm appraisal has been written. I think I've been out of the country for a few days. I think it should be out any day now, and it will be in the public domain. And I think I'd invite all of you to examine it carefully, make critiques of it, and help us, move further in the directions that we have tried to lay out in the 11th midterm appraisal, and let us know what you think. Now, the essential thrust that I want to briefly summarize for you, and then we could open up for discussion, is that what we are saying is that unless we look at the institutional design of these programs, which the government is supporting with these huge resources, and unless there is a way in which we involve local institutions, we strengthen local institutions and then involve them in the implementation of these humongous government programs, a top-down bureaucracy-driven approach is not going to work. And that is the running thread of the midterm appraisal of the 11th plan and the approach that we are now developing to the 12th plan. And that's the discussion that I hope to have with all of you today, that we need to move decisively forward in a different direction with the 12th plan. And in a sense, I'm inviting all of you through this discussion today to become partners in that process, because that is something, the intention the government has signaled is that we need to be much more open in our consultations, in our learning from a wide range of scholars, academics, activists, practitioners, people who have been engaged in these issues over the years, from whom we can get ideas to draw upon to build this new institutional framework within which water needs to be managed, or within which any of these programs, such as the NREGA, such as the Total Sanitation Campaign, need to be implemented. When we talk of sanitation, I'll just briefly touch upon that because it's completely connected with water, and again, we need to take a holistic view of water and sanitation, unified view, otherwise again, we'll go wrong as we have done. It's very clear to us through an appraisal of the sanitation campaign that while a lot of emphasis was placed on what are called IEC activities, the information, education, and communication sort of thrust was given to this campaign. And the thought was that behavioral change is very important for sustainable change in sanitation practices. The fact is that with the coming of the Nirmay Gram Puraskar, here there is an award which is given by the President of India, at the hands of the President of India, for any Gram Panchayat, a village panchayat in India which has 100% improved sanitation. So what it has done is that while the philosophy of the Total Sanitation Campaign was towards a demand-driven approach, this has again brought back the target-driven sort of rush to construct. So whether you're constructing these large dam reservoirs of thousands of crores or these 2,000 rupee toilets, the mentality seems to be the same, that let's build and forget. So you construct all these structures and then they are largely being used as storage dumps in villages, because there is no emphasis in the award, for example, on the usage of these facilities. It's been much more focused on the building, and if you've got the building in place, then you get the award at the hands of the President. So an attempt to form a demand-driven program has actually degenerated into, again, a target-driven approach. And what the midterm appraisal of the 11th plan is saying is that we need to give enough time for the message to go across. We need to make women the central players in the change that we want to bring about in practices related to sanitation. And after that, the experience of good sanitation practice across the country shows that there is a point of inflection. That till a point there is maybe resistance, maybe lack of acceptance, but once that point of inflection is reached, once a critical mass of better practice is achieved, there is a flood of demand for improved sanitation. That's been the experience of good sanitation practice in India, but you need to give enough time, you need to lay sufficient emphasis on the initial preparatory phase, without which you will not be able to achieve success in sanitation. A similar formulation characterizes what you had mentioned earlier while you were introducing me, the Parsarthi Committee report on watershed reforms in India, which was written just a few years ago. Actually, before I joined the Planning Commission, I was advisor to this committee and was responsible for drafting the report. And again in this program, which is so centrally important for 2/3 of India's landmass, which is characterized by the rain-fed drylands, which is where the kinds of non-inclusion has happened also. The tribal areas and the dryland areas are the ones which have not got included in India's impressive growth story. And in these areas, the program of crucial importance is the watershed program. But again, in the implementation of this program, we found that the kind of local institutional base, the kind of local capacities that have to be developed among the people living in that watershed, the emphasis had not been sufficiently given to that, and therefore the quality of the works that had happened and the kind of sustainability of the work that was done, the initial infusion of funds created some kinds of assets, but the maintenance of those, the carrying forth of this program was not possible because local capacities were not built, local institutions were not strengthened, and that led to a sort of collapse after the withdrawal of whatever the project management team was from these areas. So again, in the area of watershed development, which is very crucial for large parts of India, the lesson is that we need to focus on the non-engineering aspects, on the, I'm not saying we should neglect the engineering. There's a huge science of urban engineering, which in many ways the people of India know better than the civil engineers trained in our colleges who are not taught urban engineering anymore, and which is an enormously creative, science and art, if you please, which is in action in many parts of the country, but these still remain oases of excellence, and they have not been mainstreamed as they need to be. So there is that need for reform in the watershed sector, in the areas of sanitation, and the fundamental building block of these reforms has to be the building of institutions, local institutions, especially, if I may say so, the most powerful experiences have been of the self-help groups and their federations led by women, which have commanded leadership of many of the most creative programs that are happening in India today, which cover a wide range of development interventions where these institutions are, have an economic strength as well as a collective bargaining power in the market. So, it's very interesting to note that in an era of liberalization where the banking system in India was being forced to look at their profitability, and many of these banks in the remote areas of the country, India is the largest network of public sector banks in the world. Many of these banks were on the verge of being shut down because their profitability was so much in danger. In areas where there has been good work based on SAG federations, where the corpuses of these federations are so large that they have been able to sustain the turnover of many of these public sector banks in remote rural areas, remote tribal areas. And it's a remarkable achievement of this movement that they are able to manage. I mean, initially when these women tried to enter those banks, it was like entering a police station, if you know what entering a police station in a remote tribal area of India might mean. It was the same kind of treatment meted out to these people. And today, these women, these poor tribal women, poor maybe in the past tense, are like the most valued clients of these banks, because these banks are in fact seeing an enormous business proposition in the federations of these SAGs. So, and these are the women now leading the sanitation campaign, these are the women leading drinking water programs and the watershed programs. They are putting pressure on the bodies of local self-governance, the Gram Panchayats, to perform. And it is, in a sense, in these twin pillars of strength in India, the federations of self-help groups of women and the local bodies of self-governance, whether the urban local bodies or the gram panchayats, wherever these are strong, we find that the kind of institutions that you require to sustain development initiatives, which still need to come from the government because there is no corporate investment going into where there is no profit to be made, the government investments being made in these areas can only really be sustained and carried forward on a path of self-sustained development if these local institutions are given strength. And the one example that I'd like to conclude with, what I want to say, is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which is the largest employment program in human history, which the government of India initiated in 2006. And I would say in response to the verdict of 2004, where it was felt that we need to do something to respond to the crisis in rural India. There is an incredibly new architecture which this program has visualized, which is that it is a bottom-up, people-centered approach, which is entirely demand-driven, where government is, there's a constitutional obligation for the government to provide 100 days of work to people who demand it. And the plans of what work will be done under this program are to be made at the level of the village, of the Gram Sabha and the Gram Panchayat. They are the ones who are supposed to make these plans, and they are sent upwards for approval. For approval doesn't mean that they can be rejected by, say, the block or the district or the state. All that the block, district or state can do is to send the plan back in case they find something is not conforming to the guidelines of the NREGA. But otherwise, there is an obligation to accept what is coming from below. Now, this is the potential of this program. However, the record so far has not been up to this potential. The reason again is that we haven't done enough to create capacities on the ground which would enable these people to actually make those plans, implement them, and conduct the social audit, which is the sort of differential specifica of this program. This is, I'm sure you're aware of what social audit is. And this is an essential ingredient, a central ingredient of the money that is spent on NREGA. It has to be audited after the work has been completed. All of this requires enormous capacities with the institutions of local self-governance, and we have not put these in place. And I would say the major change that therefore has to be made in reforming institutional design is to actually strengthen these bodies of local self-governance. You see, since the 73rd Amendment, nearly over the last 20 years, we have spoken of the transfer of funds, functions and functionaries to these bodies. In a sense, we transferred the functions when the 73rd Amendment was passed. We devolved all the responsibility onto these bodies, but we did not do anything about the funds and the functionaries. With the coming of the NREGA in 2006, for the first time, Gram Panchayats actually got a huge amount of money. And now the problem of funds, I would say, is not there. There is more money at their command than they are being able to handle. But the problem that remains is that of the functionaries. There is no cadre which exists in this country which is accountable or answerable to these bodies of local self-governance, whether in rural areas or in urban areas. And that is why you see whatever money that the government is placing at their command is not really leading to the results. The gap that I mentioned in the beginning between outlays and outcomes remains. And unless we can strengthen these bodies, this is to do with placing greater human resources at their command, a greater diversity of human resources, and also undertaking major training of these people who are to perform these more central functions. And I was most interested to learn about this curriculum development that you talked about. I think that's a central role that we would welcome any university or research institution in this country if they could come up with innovative, not only curriculum development, but also the fact that training would have to be undertaken of a very large mass of people. This is not happening. We are in the process right now of reforming the NIRD, CAPART. These are institutions which are meant to be doing this, but they have historically failed in the mission for which they were set up. And it's centrally important to the government of India that we reform these institutions and we build partnerships with a wide range of institutions across the world, I would say, which would help perform this huge task of building the capacities of those who are supposed to shoulder the implementation of these huge programs that the government of India has been initiating.
Thank you so much.